tunes that were going round, and the kind of the abolitionist songs and all those kinds of things, to get a sense of the texture of their world. But you had to also do that on the South African side. Now, it is true that we've shifted. I mean, we've experimented with all kinds of work. There was a sense and a time in which looking at the national level in South Africa became key. And at least in terms of our understanding of a responsibility to a world, even a region, right? And what seemed to be the important issues at the time, and so you try to get a sense of a responsible sense of the world about which you're speaking, which is not the same as doing the kind of grounded ethnography where you speak to all the hitmen, which is the way. I mean, Shapiro exhaustively moved across the terrain, and you have these pictures of him sitting in the chiefly meeting place, in a three-piece suit with his legs crossed and his notebook. And all of the members of the chiefly council are on the ground, and he goes from one to the other, and he exhaustively takes the genealogy. It's not the kind of world one is dealing with.
Although, can I say something about that though? Because I think that we tend to look at what we've done over the years from now rather than from its point of origin. But our early work, at least it was never traditional in the sense of trying to do an ethnography of a people, but it was very deeply grounded in what anthropologists do. I mean, we collected genealogies until they came out of our ears. We could have, discoursed for hours on father's brother's daughter marriage, and this has been, matrilateral.
I apprenticed with a traditional healer.
Yeah, we did all that stuff.
I mean, all of that we did.
And in a way, we took it as very important because we figured that if we were going to play at the edges and make arguments for historical anthropology, for some of the later stuff that we've done, which is much further from classical anthropology, one had to do conventional anthropology well, otherwise nobody take it seriously. And I'm still perfectly happy to think back over the work we've done, stuff like bride wealth and cattle economies and things like that, because that really, it's very much like being a jazz musician out of classical tradition. You either can play your scales or you can't, right? And we learned to play those scales because we had teachers who really demanded it well. I mean, we were very privileged. Shapiro, Monica Wilson, Gina Fontaine later, all of whom really pushed us to do and to master. And they were very respectful of what we did in the end, I think, especially Jean in later times. But they pushed us very hard to...
But the difficulty now is to know what the scales are.
Ah, absolutely.
See, this is the problem.
This is 40 years on.
And that is the issue, is how one keeps faith with that, the kind of insight and the kind of humility in front of the ethnographic. I think the thing that I find most in our arguments with historians and literary theorists and so on, the thing about, and it's difficult if you're committed to a certain kind of radical view of the world. I mean, we do believe in large unfolding processes. A lot of our work has been about capitalism as its consequences, modernity and its meanings in different places, its realizations. But at the same time, how you actually keep faith with the fact that the ethnographic tells you don't know all the questions until you go. The world can surprise you. There may be a large picture, there may be a large theory, but the way that it's actually happening, the course that it takes, is never totally foreclosed and overdetermined. And to be able to do that when you're asking other kinds of questions, the questions that to us seem to be important, after the end of apartheid, for instance. Why was it when people expected discourses of democracy, that an obsession with crime and the occult overtook the popular imagination, and was very viable and tangible in the field where we did our field work, but our field work, the people who we looked at then, were now liberated South Africans who could move all over the map and didn't simply sit put. And they moved up the scale and they moved across the geographical terrain, and how did you map the life of those ideas and their significance, and where did you find the equivalent of the scales there? And it has been the challenge. It's an exciting challenge, but it's a difficult one, and that's what we've described in that one paper we published called Ethnography on an Awkward Scale, right? Because it's this question of what is the scale, and where do you find density, and where do you save yourself from falling into the trap of a certain kind of cultural analysis that takes topoi from here or there, or texts from here or there, or op-ed pieces, and presumes the connective tissue, and writes beautiful things about particular little fragments, but doesn't subscribe to the anthropological hubris of the whole. That you can never do that, but that sense of a responsibility for the connections and for the extensions and the totalizing vision is very important, I think. And that's hard to do in the world in which we live.
And coupled with that, I think, importantly, is, I think, an anthropological obligation to avoid its own irrelevance. And we live in an age in which retreat from theory has become a retreat into rank empiricism, not into the empirical or difference, but into an empiricism that doesn't actually take on the problems and the challenges of grounded theory, but also really renders itself irrelevant either by making very complex phenomena into culture, as June says, or simply avoiding the really difficult questions about the contemporary moment in the world, about what is happening, to the impact of late capital on the worlds that we work among. Our concepts, I mean, we just finished a book called Ethnicity Inc. Why? Because culture is no longer what anthropologists thought it was. Culture is now part of the market. It's a commodity,
the way it always has been.
As it has always been, but in ways that one can no longer avoid. It's now possession. It's possession that is negotiated by those who possess it, and indeed who claim all kinds of legal rights for it. The sort of notion of islands beyond history simply doesn't exist anymore. It hasn't ever, of course, but in the neoliberal moment, it presents itself with real force. After all, many of the things that we thought were units of analysis no longer bear any scrutiny at all. And a lot of anthropology has avoided the question by retreating into that form of empiricism. To us, that makes the discipline irrelevant. And we both argued very strongly for the fact that anthropology ought not ever to have been, and certainly should not now, be defined by some kind of preordained idea of a subject matter. It's not what we study, it's how we study it. So we have students now working on policing in India and computer hacking in America and all kinds of stuff.
British banking.
Yeah, I mean, you name it, they're studying it. It doesn't matter what it is. The beauty of it, it's mainly very interesting and it's very contemporary. What the anthropological dimension of it is a particular way of thinking about those problems, of estranging them, of not treating the ways in which those phenomena are lived as the conceptual repertoire through which they're to be understood, i.e. they become the problems, not the ways we address the problem. So ethnicity is not an analytic category, it's a thing in the world that has to be explained by virtue of other analytic categories. And in that way, the anthropological capacity to estrange, to decompose and deconstruct surfaces in order to explain them, I think is what this is about. And that really does have to do with a kind of courage, simultaneous courage and humility in the face of the moment. We live in a very complex moment, but we can neither avoid it nor allow it simply to be treated at face value, and unless we do too much.
Yeah, I think one of the other issues is this, and it's a problem that we've struggled with quite a lot in our recent work, is that it's simultaneously a commitment to the sense that the manifestations of big processes are always particular, grounded, mediated in complicated ways, and they need to be recognized, and they also have to be grounded in the subjectivity of actors. And I think that's another thing that anthropology brings, as a kind of phenomenology, right? Is that you always assume that human beings may not make history exactly as they please, but they try to make it somewhat as they please, right? So there is a kind of agentive, and that's something that we engage in people's consciousness and so on. But at the same time, and that implies very particular local kinds of, and you work hard to know a place and to have the right to kind of write about it. But at the same time, there are family resemblances, there are global processes, and those of us, and I think both of you share this, is that we live simultaneously in several parts of the world. We live half the year in South Africa. We spend lots of time in England, where we taught and students, and we live here. And what you see there, I mean, these are all areas of advanced capitalist modernity, but the formations in each place are different. You know? They're singular, and so the relationship between the similarity and the difference is very important. At the same time, it's moments like this where you see how, for instance, crises have impacts that require that you talk comparatively over a large span of time. What is neoliberalism, for instance? That much abused and much debated construct. How do we begin to ask questions that enable us to see that there are things going on in South Africa, England, and now that look very similar? And somehow one has to be able to do justice to the particularity of a grounded understanding, but also see those bigger questions, not only about difference, it's not only about distinctiveness, it's not only about it's more complicated or they do it differently there. And anthropology has too easily allowed itself to take that kind of line. And we're very suspicious of looking at similarity, particularly globally connected similarities. Yeah. which don't imply simple determinations,
Right.
but they imply that we have to look at those broad pictures and say it's not only about the distinctiveness, but it's about things that are affecting the world and affecting places differently depending on where they sit. On what is a single kind of structured landscape. And I think that's very difficult.
Yeah, and the courage to theorize, I think, is crucial. The courage to theorize critically. I mean, we ran into this after 1994 when we wrote about occult economies, the rise of witchcraft after the end of apartheid. And it was very clear to us that the forms of witchcraft epidemic, witch killings in South Africa, had a great deal to do with rising unemployment and with the impact of structural adjustment on the South African countryside, etc., etc. When we first published this work, several anthropologists said, this is ridiculous. It's all about local relations. It's about local hatreds and local this and that. Now, trivially, that was correct. Of course it was about local things, but those local things don't end. The chains of determination at the local. It's no mistaking that many of the people who have been killed in the context of who have been killed in the context of these witch killings were killing people because they believed that they had taken jobs away, etc. We kept insisting that there was a hinterland that required explanation here. A lot of anthropologists said, no, stop at the local. Well, yeah, but that's exactly what confines anthropology to irrelevance.
But there was also an issue that linked. Yeah, there was an issue also that linked. The other thing we were saying was that advanced capitalism at this point had seen the entering in of the occult and the speculative in many domains that were kind of equivalents elsewhere of the very evident witchcraft phenomena in Southern Africa, right? Mm-hmm. So that things like Ponzi schemes and pyramid schemes going on here, the rise of certain kinds of religious enchanted movements, the debate about various forms of spirituality and speculation were part of a moment that had to do with a changing relationship between space, production, nation, and people's understandings of value. And that meant that we took some very wild leaps. Making the point that there were arguments about whether something like witchcraft, which has always been understood in terms of the minutiae of precisely those kinds of kinship relations and tensions, contradictions we were talking about later, could also be local mediations or refractions of larger scale, sort of shifts, tectonic shifts in the political and economic and cultural universe in which people live. But we also argued that, and we started out that paper on occult economies, with which we had quite a sort of well-versed argument with Sally Moore, for instance, about the nature of theory and evidence, that in fact you were seeing in structurally equivalent places, like in Russia, for instance, you were seeing things that were the equivalent, in terms of which there seemed to be the entry into not only there were both spectres and speculation in the way in which the market seemed to be working, because people could not quite understand how value was moving, why suddenly some people were becoming wealthy and others not. What was the magic of this form of free market they kept hearing about, and the reality of their accessibility to these things? And so we argued that there were similarities that you couldn't ignore, even although they weren't simply comparable. Now, that's not always a safe and popular move to make. But that sort of thing I think anthropologists should think about. I mean, we said, think about cargo cults, which is where our connection all the way back to Peter Worsley came. Think about cargo cults and the way in which people are building warehouses, in parts of the new economic frontier, hoping that business will come and land. Or villages in Africa where you say, please, will the tourists come to our village, not the next one, we're going to lay everything there so that we hope that there will be takeoff. So there were things there that we wanted to bring together that people
they precisely took the anthropological tradition, the classical tradition, and said, okay, how does one make sense of it in the historical moment of the here and now? And how Monica Wilson and Godfrey wrote a famous book about social change, where they talk about scale as one of the great anthropological problems. And this is what we're dealing with, really, that the scale of the occult had expanded. I mean, we were being told by our own informants, the difference between Satanism and witchcraft was that Satanism was global. It was about space-time compression. This
high octane model.
High octane, yeah, exactly. So our informants were they were providing theories that our colleagues at the London School of Economics wouldn't hear, right? Whatever happened to native voice, it got sort of fetishized and lost, because if the natives don't say what you want, of course, it becomes a problem. But the point that she's making, which is very powerful, is that it's precisely this, the adoption of the classical tradition into asking questions about estrangement, that take phenomena that don't seem as though they're the same, and are interestingly both similar and different, that raise questions that allow an anthropological imagination to answer them, even though they spread way beyond the scale of discipline. And that actually led us to an edited volume on millennial capitalism, where we made the argument that understanding capitalism was very much about understanding the old issue of millennialism in the ways that anthropologists had understood it before, right? But expanded into the moment, expanded into literally the year 2000, where it was capitalism itself that became salvific. That as it were, the temporality of the moment, the shift of the millennium, and the millennial sense that capitalism would deliver salvation, as it did promise, in the year 2000. After all, it was that gave us the Bush administration and this extraordinary faith in deregulating everything. The market would solve everything, which was as occultic and salvific a movement that one can imagine. History is going to look back at and say, why didn't anthropology understand this from way back? Because it really was an anthropological problem.
The interesting thing was that Jeremy Cronin, who's the Deputy Secretary of the South African Communist Party, but also a Member of Parliament and a noted poet, wrote a wonderful poem about the kind of, it was really about a millennial movement in the Eastern Cape that happened on the dawn of overrule in the
19th century.
Yes, but I'm thinking exactly when. But anyway, in the Eastern Cape in South Africa, it was about killing cattle so that the millennium would arrive. And what he did was he used that as a parallel for the current moment of market takeoff. And this was just at the point where the likes of Mbeki was saying, well, the real solution in South Africa has to be, ultimately, in tune with market neoliberalism. And so he was, just after we'd written this book, he used this image. I mean, he didn't know, he doesn't read anthropology, he's got much more significant things to do. But that same image, and that's what is interesting, is the sense that you really are dealing with something which is a worldwide movement or worldwide epochal sort of development that settles differently in different places, but is connected, its logic is connected.
Which is, by the way, I mean, it's interesting. I think that we'll look back on the extraordinary effervescence surrounding the Obama election in America as a profoundly anthropological moment. That is to say, one that is better understood through Durkheim and through our knowledge of a particular form of social effervescence and the way these congeal into what look like social movements, but are moments of deep populism, much better than we will understand it through an orthodox political analysis or economic analysis. So, in a way, the plea for anthropology, not merely to leave the reservation, but to lose its reservations about confronting the contemporary, seems the only way that we're going to save ourselves from crashing irrelevance. And one sees in all kinds of places. I mean, the various new anthropologies that declare themselves. The anthropology of Christianity, the anthropology of this, the anthropology of that, all seem to be motivated by an impulse to shrink back into an anthropology which is either profoundly cultural or profoundly localizing. Whereas to me and to Jean as well, I think, this seems to be really the death of the discipline lies in, as it were, a reproductive impulse rather than a productive engagement with the critical edges of the world we live in. It's ironic because, as we say, if anthropology is about estrangement, it is strange to us that anthropology is resisting estrangement. And
not in all quarters.
I mean, our students, of course, our student generation are doing extraordinary things, but they still run into difficulties in some contexts.
But I think some of the work, for instance, that you yourself have been part of, Cameron, in global pharmaceuticals, or the ways in which you can track into particular intersections. Like, for instance, global pharmaceuticals, whether it's in the marketing or the testing or whatever, that there are intersections there that enable you to do really interesting things. And anthropologists have worked very well with those, using their own models and moving beyond.
No, I think that's true. I think that's true. I had much more in mind, not so much the more interesting critical edges of American anthropology, but much more British, European, and Commonwealth anthropology, which seems much more wedded.
European anthropology is going through a renaissance.
Well,
it's very interesting.
Where.
The European Anthropological Association is flexing its muscles in very interesting ways, and that's fascinating because people from different language traditions come together.
Maybe.
You know, and I mean, in Germany, for instance, I mean, there are lots of places on the continent where, in fact, people who are interested in things like global humanitarianism and NGOs, I mean, there are things. The danger there, though, is that it can become disengaged from the kind of grounded ethnography that we started talking.
Yeah, it's a question I would ask you about in training your students. You yourselves, because of who you are and the circumstances in which you set out, were able to successfully take on both sides of the dialectic, as you put it earlier. But you need a license to do that.
Exactly.
That's quite a lot to hand to a graduate student to undertake, even if you think it's the most important and current challenge.
It's a very difficult thing. Look, even if you think of the career of our graduate students, I mean, when it comes to teaching theory, for instance, we now start at Augustine, we go through the whole of the Western philosophical tradition, we do anthropology, we go into literary theory. Right? When they put their exam lists together, when I first arrived at this university, only anthropological texts, and we would argue about, ancestors like Weber. He didn't really, Durkheim, yes, Weber, not so sure, now, I mean, the whole of the Western philosophical, people will get into Spinoza because he's had a real impact on the Nietzscheans who write about affect and Carl Schmitt. And there are anthropology lists that have very little anthropology on at all. Or if they do, they've got to have everything else. They've got to be responsible for everything. And there are things to be said for a certain limited disciplinarity. In a way, you can only be transdisciplinary if you have some sense of discipline to start with. And it's very hard to know. Now, I think the burden of what we've been saying is it's more a mode of approach and a kind of, I think at basis, anthropology's identity was laid in practice, in a certain ethnographic kind of practice, right? And so, one has extended the idea of what practice involves back to Marx, back to other kinds of pragmatists, William J., whatever. But when it comes to theory, it's difficult to know how you can be responsible to all of that and still have a sense of mastery of a particular craft. And then when it comes to field work, it's extremely difficult because people work in fields that, and the difficulty is to, have the bounded system but the openness to the idea of the full range, if you like, of forces and factors and flows that produce the local that you're looking at, to use Arjun Apoggiaro's terms, right? And how you get that sensitivity still with the sense that you can carve out a piece that speaks meaningfully to these larger processes and problems. That's very difficult to do. And often it's not just, sometimes it involves archival work to be able to understand why, a free trade zone, in northern Namibia appears when it does, and why the Chinese there selling German designer kitchens, right? That sort of problem, which are real problems that are being researched right now. Where do you begin? You have to be responsible to very large bodies of reading, knowledge, and theoretical conceptualization to be able to find that little place before you go there.
And we struggle with it. I mean, in this sense, there isn't an answer to the question. There are answers that each piece of work with each student and each project actually struggles to find out. That to me, I think, is, again, the creative possibility of anthropology, that we actually engage with those questions. Sometimes the answers are more successful than they are at other times, there's no doubt about that. But the degree to which one sticks with a model of the discipline, predicated, as we said, on estrangement, etc., that is tied to a dialectic of the inductive and the deductive, that constantly says, what is the ethnographic problem that I or we want to address? What is the theoretical and conceptual frame that is commensurate to that problem? How then do I design a methodology that can convince anybody other than myself, my parents and my dog, that this actually is convincing? The SSRC or committee or peers, i.e., and we constantly say to our students, tell us why we should believe that your ethnography leads to the conclusion or the solution to the problem that you're positing.
And why should we be interested?
Exactly, which was an old Max Gluckman question. Why should we be interested in your work?
Fixation, right?
That it's your duty to tell us, not our duty to figure it out. And your duty to tell the world. That's one of the reasons our students actually do quite well in the world, because they're faced with that question from day one. But the notion of commensuration of the dialectic of the inductive and the deductive, of method to claim, of problem to solution, of argumentation, of a fealty to the detail. seems to us to be the only sort of abstract way of formulating an answer to a question which is always answered in the practice. So you can't tell before the event. I mean, we constantly go through exercises with our students. How are you going to convince the SSRC? What sorts of commensurate? How are you actually going to tell us how rogue sociality works amongst diamond minders in Angola? Tell us. What are you going to look for? What is it actually going to look like? When you're there, who are you going to talk to and how? And then how are you going to convince us that the conversations or whatever the data was ought to tell us about the construct that you're developing to explain this phenomenon?
Also we're talking here as if it were the two of us and our students. I mean, we have worked in this university, at the University of Chicago, which is an extraordinary place. I mean, we travel the world, we've been to many places.
The much bigger than the two of us.
There's no place like this for a series of historical reasons. It's not only people, it's the place. It's just the coming together on the south side of Chicago in a very condensed space. It's a very sort of intense and sometimes overwhelmingly so environment. But one of the things that is developed there is a very strong sense of the craft of anthropology and our sense of responsibility as teachers. Yeah? We all love teaching and we feel it as a calling, as it were. And we've designed a set of courses, from theoretical courses to methods courses to research design courses, where we actually hammer out
all of these things.
These are required courses for the students. Right?
Every student has to go through these.
And they go through as cohorts, and they've got to learn that first of all, designing research proposals is not a natural form. It doesn't come naturally to anybody. And your first efforts will be ham-fisted, and we get a group of students at the same stage to trust each other enough and to be respectful enough to work interactively on developing their projects, right? And this is something that the department has done.
We also have workshops that do
and this is right, workshops
yeah.
and regular seminars. We really believe in the cultures of discourse, that people have got to be around interesting arguments made anthropologically from the moment they come to university, but to graduate school in particular. So they develop a sensibility that's anthropological, and then they've got to find something in the world. Not an abstract, you're not interested, in excess theory of why. You're interested in why this has happened or taken the shape it has there now. And the question is, how then do you move from that outwards to the commensurate kinds of knowledge that you need? And that's where we work with them, and we go through the proposals painfully. First of all, a one-page example, a statement of problem. Then you tie the method to that, and the method and the statement of the problem have to speak to each other. Then the theoretical dimensions, which literatures are drawn upon, what kinds of arguments.
It's very rigorous
that
training.
Sort of thing.
And they have to answer. Jean has developed the mantra many years ago, which has just become a department mantra, which is, to what problem is this research an answer? And until you can actually...
What question?
To what question, what problem? Until a student can actually frame that, nobody takes it, neither their peers nor their teachers take them seriously. The other side of the workshop, this deeply socialized mode of producing anthropology, is also the implicit question always, what is the value added from an anthropological perspective? I.e., what are you doing that your peers in sociology or psychology or political theory or political science or whatever don't add? And we expect them to have an answer to that question. There must be an anthropology. Now, some students do this in very mechanical ways and some do it in very creative ways, but it's something that they internalize very, very early. And the workshop system is also an apprenticeship system. The faculty present their work, and it's chopped about as much as any students is chopped about.
So students always commentate on the faculty.
So they actually see how we're producing work as well as being answerable to each other. And that has, it's not an egalitarian ethos, because there isn't an egalitarian ethos really in graduate teaching, but it does allow the possibility of an apprenticeship ethos in which we're all apprentices basically. And I don't think that we've written anything, or certainly haven't edited a book since we've been here 30 years, that hasn't in some sense been deeply in conversation with what our students are arguing and talking about. Wherever we go to other universities, we want to speak to graduate students. Yes, of course we do. What questions do you have to ask? The first question we ask them is, what are you guys arguing about? Right? And very often we get blank stares. Sometimes we get very creative answers. But that's what we expect our students to know. What are you arguing about? What are the real issues here? Because if you guys who are 25 to 30 aren't arguing about the world in interesting ways, believe me, your discipline's dead. But
the fascinating thing is that anthropology in some ways might indeed be, it's counter-hegemonic, it's marginal, it's threatened in many places. But the ideas from anthropology are still so generative. be far beyond the discipline, and everybody's doing what they call ethnography.
Yeah.
Often it just means like talking to people, right? But it's ethnography. And it's nursing, accountancy. They're all ostensibly now doing, ethnography. So there is still that sense that there's an extraordinary generative, productive quality of asking questions against the grain.
That's right.
Looking against the grain, not assuming, never assuming the surface narrative is what's going on. Right?
It's
That's the
interesting.
whole thing.
George Marcus wrote a paper some time, not very long ago. So it's actually a very, very interesting paper, very thoughtful piece. In which he says, it's about basically the future of anthropology. He says, look, institutionally anthropology is doing fine, most of the big departments are thriving, etc., etc. We're getting more and more undergraduate enrollments, which is true. But he said what concerned him was that we become, he doesn't use the term, but we become a parasite discipline in the sense that we weren't producing our own theory, that we were evoking post-colonial studies, critical feminism, etc., etc., and he gave an interesting list. I actually think the opposite is true in some respects, that an enormous proportion of discourses in other disciplines are actually looking to anthropology for all kinds of inspiration. For example...
Inspiration, maybe not grand theory.
Not grand theory, because there isn't much grand theory around.
Grand theory is a generic product of the social.
Well, exactly.
Human sciences,
it doesn't come from any discipline.
It doesn't come from any particular
but certainly not. But the fact is that, when you look at, for example, recent stuff in law and society, the impact of anthropology is enormous. Look at the new strain of the cultural study of politics and political theory. A tremendous debt to anthropology. And the ethnographic sensibility, as Jean says, is everywhere. And these days, you can't have a respectable department of anything without ethnography. So I don't think that we've got anything to be particularly concerned about in that respect. What we have to be concerned about is the acuity of our questions in interrogating this very puzzling world we live in. We've said before, an age of revolution, which we only dimly understand, and for which we're only dimly beginning to construct a discursive repertoire.
And it's about South Africa, because you say you're spending about half the year there every year. So there's both the community of people you refer to who were and are South African anthropologists, and then also the research and the continuation of the research with the specific kinds of problems relevant to South Africa. So how would you say you're moving that trajectory forward?
The story is that we have large numbers of students who work in Southern Africa and in Africa, although the biggest proportion of our students don't. So we're both very invested in that region, but we're also very keen to see that region invest in anthropology that is not just parochial, right? That is more global, will take on wider sorts of issues. And we take an undergraduate group there every year. But since the end of apartheid, during the apartheid years, there was a boycott, an academic boycott called by the ANC, and we respected it. We didn't have much to do with the universities during that time, although we visited our families there. But afterwards, we went back and got very involved in various kinds of projects to try and get the social sciences up and running again after a period of incredible, sort of undermining during the apartheid years. And we've been going back ever since, both to do that, to work in various contexts, reviewing departments, participating in the training of students, having students coming over here and spending time with us and doing postdocs, having our students there and so on, but also doing our own research, which we always, our first sort of engagement with critical feedback on our own work is always in South Africa, at the various universities.
And we have ongoing research projects, and we're doing now a major project on crime and policing, and we will probably follow up our Ethnicity Inc. book with another study of the same phenomenon among the so-called Bushmen, the San, and some Tswana peoples also involved in the sort of new political economy of identity. So we have ongoing research all the time. In addition to our 24 students we take there every year for 11 weeks. As Jean says, our engagement with the universities, we're both honorary professors at the University of Cape Town. We have close links with Wits Institute for Social and Economic Research, WISER, which we've actually been involved in as kind of friendly outsiders from the very beginning.
And for the first time now, two of our PhD students have taken up, assistant professorships and are writing papers about, rethinking, reimagining, anthropology in Southern Africa now, which is really exciting.
Yeah, it's very exciting.
So
we see basically Chicago anthropology being implanted in South Africa with
but
students
being
who
remade
came
there.
from South Africa, but being remade in a very, we've got a pet project which is basically called Theory from the South. And the argument of the project as a general thing is that for 200 years, the social sciences have believed that theory is produced in the north and the data comes from the south. Well, we and our students collectively think that the world has turned over, that interesting theory is coming from the south and the north is becoming more a source of at least comparative data. And this younger generation, who are incredibly smart and wonderfully able, are putting their own stamp on that kind of issue. They're very independent minded because we don't ever want our
They come from all
students
kinds of backgrounds.
Yeah.
Black and white, Afrikaans, English speaking.
Gay,
it's really
straight,
interesting
male, female,
from
you
that
name
point
it,
of
there
view.
it is.
Yeah.
But for us, it's a great matter of pride to see our students basically, go it alone, become an independent new generation, thinking new thoughts, doing new things. The last thing we've ever wanted our students to do is what we do, and I must say they do us proud in exceeding us in all kinds of ways. So we have ongoing connections there, and of course lots of our friends who left South Africa roughly the time that we did, who are now back. We're part of a very lively network of scholars and
beyond the academy.
Yeah,
That's the
beyond the
other
academy.
thing. The relationship between the academy and the public world in South Africa is much more porous. So when we're there, we're much more involved in public debate, newspaper debate. We have friends who are in Parliament who are very involved in advising the new kind of political movements that are emerging right now as we speak, and so on. And we've done everything from being involved in kind of hip hop collectives that wanted to read social theory to
advising the Constitutional Court.
Yeah, so
everything.
It's a very different kind of, much more sort of immediately engaged world, and one of incredible possibility and great hazards.
But enormous dynamism. Enormous dynamism.
Amazing public debate.
Yeah. I mean, we can't sit, we have our usual haunts. We can't go to breakfast in our local place without half a dozen people at the table within 10 minutes arguing about whatever's going on in politics that day. It's that kind of society. Everybody's listening to the radio, everybody's
and
taking
they're very
signs.
interested in culture.
Yeah.
This is the thing that for years anthropology, was the colonizing pariah discipline. But with the kind of reanimation of culture, for good or ill, as a site of claims and identity, right? Anthropology is very chic, right?
Yeah.
And there are large numbers of black
asked,
South Africans who want to learn anthropology and want to have anthropological engagement with their own cultural projects and so on. So that's another interesting moment.
Being approached and asked to join in conversations about the broadest sets of things. It's really, really interesting. But there's a sense of respect that anthropology actually has something to say to public discourse. It's no longer any form of pariah. I mean, quite the opposite. The legal profession, for the first time, is engaging seriously with legal anthropology. In the newspapers, our colleague and friend, our dear friend Steve Robbins, is a major op-ed writer in the local papers,
and he's
he
a
writes,
professor of anthropology.
Yeah, and he writes really serious, good stuff. I mean, so there's an enormous amount of sense that this is, and when the Bushmen, San, they call themselves Bushmen in Botswana, San in South Africa, engaged in their land claims case, their human rights lawyer consultant, whose daughter, interestingly, was doing an anthropology degree, was consulting Steve and various other anthropologists, Kees van der Waal also, from Stellenbosch University, on how this kind of politics is going to take shape in South Africa. So there's this constant vibrancy, constant sense of engagement, land claims. A lot of anthropologists are engaged, not in the old sort of applied anthropology sense, but in an ongoing public discourse about what ought to be happening.
Medical ethics. I mean, I've been teaching for 3 years with Solly Benneter, who's a medical ethicist and former head of the medical school at UCT. And we have a course on things you've worked on yourself, which is, what should be the approach of global pharmaceuticals wanting to do research in Southern Africa? What kind of human subject protection, what kind of political constraint should be placed on profiteering in South Africa, which is a very desirable research destination, but also a vulnerable one. And that's where they call in anthropologists, and you work with people who sit on these committees and so on. and debate the nature of the sort of global, cultural, political issues involved. So
And
that's
the,
very
and
nice.
the undergraduates, and the undergraduates picking up on that, volunteer for TAC, for TAC Treatment Action Campaign, and AIDS activism, for Bush Radio, a community radio station. They teach it at a local township school. They do all kinds of stuff, and some of them volunteer at the Institute for Security Studies and do large-scale survey work for them. Others work in sort of philanthropy and stuff. They just get engaged because, again, there's a sense that this is a world of engagements.